Did McLaren really improve its car in Japan? Or did it simply understand something that Mercedes still masters better than anyone? Because while everyone was looking at Oscar Piastri's result, Andrea Stella dropped one of the most important keys of the entire season, and almost no one noticed. There were no new parts. There were no visible evolutions. But suddenly, Piastri went from not having completed a single race to being fighting head-to-head against Mercedes. What changed then? The answer isn't in the car, it's in how McLaren learned to use it. To really understand what happened to Oscar Piastri in Japan, you have to start by dismantling an idea that may seem logical, but is completely wrong. It was not a traditional car improvement. It wasn't an aerodynamic evolution. It wasn't a new package. It wasn't an obvious gain in pure performance. It was something much deeper and at the same time much more difficult to detect. Because what changed at McLaren was not the what, but the how. Piastri arrived at Suzuka in an extreme situation, practically at an absolute disadvantage compared to his direct rivals. While drivers like George Russell or Kimi Antonelli were already accumulating real kilometers in racing conditions, he barely had any experience under the new regulations. He had not completed a single race in Australia due to his incident before the start, and in China he could not even take part due to technical problems with the team. This means that, in a context where Formula One has changed radically, especially in electrical energy management, Piastri was competing without one of the most important assets: real race experience. And this is key to understand because in 2026 it is not enough to have a fast car. Pilots must now extremely precisely manage electrical power, deciding when to deploy it, when to recover it, and how to balance it with the performance of the heat engine. Every lap is a learning experience. Every stint is critical information. And Piastri simply did not have that accumulated learning. This is where Andrea Stella's first big revelation comes in. The problem wasn't just the car, it was the lack of complete understanding of the system in real conditions. McLaren was not fully exploiting the Mercedes power unit, not because it was inferior, but because they did not yet fully understand how to use it within this new regulation. And then Japan arrives, and everything changes. But not as many think. McLaren made no visible improvements. There were no new parts or structural changes to the MCL40. While other teams introduced evolutions, they arrived with practically the same car. And yet, the performance was completely different. Piastri went from being at a complete disadvantage to competing directly against Mercedes. The explanation lies in something that is not seen: understanding. During the previous weeks, McLaren worked intensively on the car's energy management. Not in changing the hardware, but in optimizing the software, deployment strategies, energy recovery, and above all, the way in which the pilot interacts with that entire system on the runway. That is, they transformed the way in which the car delivers its performance. And this has a direct impact on Piastri. Because suddenly, you go from driving a car that is unpredictable and limited in its exploitation, to having a much more coherent, more consistent, and more competitive tool at a sustained pace. It's not that the car is faster in absolute terms, it's that it is now much more usable at the limit. Stella makes it clear, the difference with Mercedes in the exploitation of the power unit has been significantly reduced. And when that happens, the pilot can begin to compete on equal terms in certain scenarios. But this opens up another even more important reality. If the engine is no longer the main problem, then the McLaren's true limit lies elsewhere. But this is where the story takes a much more interesting turn. Because when McLaren begins to close the gap with Mercedes in power unit management, it automatically exposes its true problem. And this can no longer be hidden. Andrea Stella admits it bluntly. The MCL40's biggest deficit is no longer in the engine, it is in the chassis. And this completely changes the reading of what we saw with Piastri in Japan. Because fighting Mercedes no longer depends solely on how you manage energy, but on how good your car is in its structural basis. That is, in curves, in stability, in balance, and how the car responds when the driver takes it to the absolute limit. And this is where the real battle begins. Piastri, with this new understanding of the car, manages to put himself in a position where he can compete. He can stay in rhythm, he can respond, he can defend. But it cannot impose. It cannot make a difference consistently. And that is no coincidence. Because while McLaren has taken a step forward in the invisible energy management, Mercedes still has a clear advantage in the physical. A more complete, more balanced, more refined chassis in real racing conditions. This explains why the fight was so tight, but never fully controlled by Piastri. Now, there is a technical detail that changes everything and that Stella very subtly hints at. The way in which McLaren and Mercedes are using energy is completely different. Mercedes continues to opt for more aggressive performance peaks. moments where they release all the available power to maximize speed at key points. Instead, McLaren has opted for a much more conservative, more linear, more constant philosophy. And what does this mean on the track? That Piastri has a more predictable car, more stable in pace, capable of sustaining competitive laps without major crashes, but with less ability to hit at key moments. Less pure attack capacity. And this in Formula One is fundamental. Because it's not just about being fast, it's about when you're fast. That's where Mercedes still has the advantage. In qualifying, in overtaking, in decisive moments, that extra energy well used makes the difference. While McLaren builds its performance from consistency. And here Piastri's true merit appears. Because with less experience, with a car that still has structural limitations, and with a less aggressive performance philosophy, he manages to get into the direct fight. It manages to compensate with intelligence, with adaptation, with an increasingly precise reading of the car. But it also makes clear something that is impossible to ignore. This is just the beginning. Because if McLaren has already managed to reduce the disadvantage in the power unit, and now clearly identifies that the next step is in the chassis, then the room for improvement is enormous. And that is exactly what is starting to worry the rest. And this is where everything fits. Because what Andrea Stella revealed in Japan not only explains McLaren's present, but completely defines its immediate future. What we saw with Oscar Piastri was not an isolated performance peak, nor a specific circumstance favored by the circuit or the conditions. It was the first real demonstration that McLaren has crossed a critical barrier, fully understanding its power unit within the new regulations. And when a team reaches that level of understanding, progress stops being slow and becomes exponential. Because until now, McLaren was limited by something invisible. They couldn't extract the full potential of the car, they couldn't compete on equal terms, not because they lacked parts, but because they lacked knowledge. And that's much harder to fix, but also much more powerful when you finally get it. Japan was that turning point. From here, the panorama changes completely. Because if the deficit with Mercedes in the exploitation of the power unit is already minimal, as Stella himself confirms, then all the team's development can focus on a single objective, the chassis. And that radically simplifies the technical management of the project. They no longer have to divide resources between multiple problems. They are no longer chasing shadows. Now they know exactly where they are losing performance. And that, in Formula One, is a huge advantage. Because it means that each future improvement will have a direct, measurable, cumulative impact. It means that any advance in balance, stability, aerodynamic load will immediately translate into performance on the track, without the limitations previously imposed by energy management. And this is where Piastri's role becomes even more relevant. Japan was not only important for the result, but for what it allowed the driver to accumulate real experience, understand the behavior of the car in racing conditions, adapt to that new energy management philosophy that McLaren has developed. Every lap he completed was information, it was learning, it was progress. And this is key because now Piastri is no longer at a disadvantage. Now you have a base. Now you have references. Now you can start to really exploit the car's potential. Therefore, what we saw in Suzuka is not McLaren's limit. It is the starting point. And if we put all the pieces together, the improvement in understanding of the car, the reduction of the gap with Mercedes, the clear identification of the problem in the chassis, and the progressive growth of Piastri, the message is forceful. McLaren is no longer trying to understand the game. Now he's starting to really play it. And in the end, it all comes down to an idea that completely changes McLaren's narrative after Japan. They didn't improve the car, they learned how to use it. Because while many are still waiting for large aerodynamic packages or visible evolutions to explain Oscar Piastri's leap in performance, the reality is much deeper. McLaren took the step that separates the competitive teams from the truly dangerous ones, understanding how to extract the full potential of what they already have. Japan was not a coincidence, it was a revelation. It was the moment in which we saw Piastri go from a total disadvantage to competing face-to-face with Mercedes, not because his car was superior, but because for the first time he was in a position to exploit what he had in his hands. And when that happens, performance stops being an unknown and becomes a consequence. But he also made something even clearer. The next step has already been identified. The chassis. That is now the real limit of the MCL 40. And that is, paradoxically, great news for McLaren. Because it is a tangible, measurable, developable problem. It is not a technical mystery or a lack of understanding. It is a clear direction. And when a Formula One team has clarity, it evolves much faster than the rest. Therefore, Japan is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of something much bigger. Because if with a car still incomplete, with obvious structural limitations and with a driver who was just beginning to understand the system, they were already able to fight against Mercedes. So the real question is not what they did in Suzuka. The real question is, what is going to happen when all of that is completely aligned? And that's where this story gets really dangerous. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.